Friends, I welcome you to my channel. Before listening to this story, I will ask you to like and subscribe. It is not difficult for you, but it is pleasant for me. And we're starting. Did you know that the average high school romance lasts about 3 weeks? Well, Katie Thomas and Greg Hollander broke that record by about 40 years. They met when she was just a freshman and he was a sophomore. From that moment on, they became inseparable. Yes, they had that true mythical love that seems to have stood the test of time and remained pure. Now, before you stop reading about this cute couple, I have to tell you that Kat and I were married for about 30 of those years, and I thought we were really happy. Our marriage was satisfactory, and when Katie gave birth to our daughter Joan, it brought us even closer together. In general, I was a happy person in those years. Let me introduce someone to bring you up to date on this hot story. As for me, I'm Thomas Marsh, and Katie has been my loving wife, as I mentioned, for about the last 30 years. As I mentioned earlier, Kat and Greg dated throughout high school, and yes, she did lose her virginity to Greg. We know that all high school romances end eventually, only in this case it was more like a temporary break. Since Greg was a year older than Katie at school, he decided to earn a lot of money after graduation to marry Katie. That's what my wife says, and she often said it during our marriage. Anyway, after graduating from high school, Greg went to work on a pipeline in Alaska with his uncle, and that's why the problem started. It seems that Greg stopped writing shortly after landing there, and that left Kat alone in her senior year. Eventually, she started dating some guy named Sam or Simpson or whatever, but it wasn't serious, since her heart still belonged to her one and only Greg. Kat waited like an obedient friend, but Greg was absent and was not very sociable. Obviously, Greg really enjoyed working on the pipeline, and he began a rather nomadic life, believing that his dear Katie was still waiting for him to get rich and hug her on his return. Well, that definitely didn't happen. The reality of life is that everything goes on as usual and nothing ever stays the same. This also applied to Katie when she went to college, got her degree, and met me at a party when she was 24. I was a little older than her at 29, but we were a good couple. I fell in love with her the moment I met her, and I thought she had done the same to me. Our marriage was quite normal, and the only drawback during our relationship was that 2 days before our wedding ceremony, a letter from Greg arrived. Just like the prodigal son, he was finally coming home and wanted her to meet him. Thank God that Kat's mother dissuaded her from returning to him, saying that a new life awaited her, and she should not waste time on this asshole, as she called him. After several tense emotional moments during which I worried that she was actually going to cancel the wedding, Katie finally went through the ceremony, becoming my wife, Mrs. Katie Marsh. When Greg finally showed up, it was already too late, as Kat and I were already on our honeymoon. Greg, in a fit of despondency, apparently enlisted in the Marines. After the honeymoon, we settled into our new life. Kat was a nurse, and I was an insurer at a large insurance company. The job is certainly not glamorous, but it is stable and pays the bills. My marriage was solid, but there was only one tiny hitch that kept repeating itself. Greg started texting with Katie, and she happily replied to him. When I asked her if it was necessary, she was indignant and said, "Oh, don't be jealous. He's an old friend of mine who's single and serving in the Marines, and I'm just writing to keep him in the mood." Well, I can't plead ignorance since I knew that he wrote to her regularly, and I also knew that she replied to him regularly. Neither her family nor I could convince her to stop writing until she received a letter saying that he had married a girl where he served. This stopped the correspondence, and I regained my peace of mind. For the next 3 years, I think she got 3 Christmas cards from Greg, and that was it. During this break in correspondence with Greg, our daughter Joan was born. With our child, Katie and I came together like a team of mules and worked hard building a house and household so that Joan would have a good life. Yes, life was good in those days, and we both worked together to raise and take care of our child. But as it always happens, something comes along that will spoil it. One day, Katie received a letter from Greg. She never talked about it, but I noticed that after that, our stamp consumption started to grow. I concluded that she was writing to Greg again, but I ignored it. After all, he was somewhere making the world safe for democracy, and I was here protecting my family's world from want. If they wanted to write to each other, it was really their business, no matter how I felt about it. Eventually, Kat started sharing some of the information she had received from Greg with me. He divorced his first wife, but now he had another one. He had seen battles and had apparently been awarded high honors. I was only half listening, but Katie spoke with pride for her soldier. I corrected her by saying that he would be upset if he was called a soldier since he was a Marine. Katie giggled sweetly and said, "Oh, I think I'd better watch this." Watching her talk about him really depressed me, but I hoped that one day she would finally forget about him and focus on her family. Well, she's never done that. Greg had been in the Marines for 30 years, had been married and divorced 3 times, and now he had enough medals to arouse the envy of General Patton. I realized with horror that although Greg had become more charming in my wife's eyes over the years, I had only aged and become predictable. My only hope was that Greg, when he was discharged from the Army, would settle somewhere far away from us. Unfortunately, he didn't do that, and that's where we are right now. Joan, our daughter, has grown up and is now married to a great guy, Frank Campbell. Another great news is that they are expecting their first child. I'm 60 now, and I'm looking forward to the magic number 65 to retire and spend my last few years in peace and tranquility. Katie still looks great and could still make my heart beat faster. I had no idea that the tranquility of my life would soon be a thing of the past. It was Thursday when I returned home to find Kat, dressed to the nines, telling me that we had a table reserved for dinner at 7. At first I thought I had memory loss and missed an anniversary or a birthday, but after a few quick calculations I realized that this was not the case. Well, I played along and went to our bedroom to get myself cleaned up and try to look about in the same league as Kat. The dinner was excellent, and the restaurant was packed, which made me think that Kat had something else on her mind besides just good food. Towards the end of our meal, I looked at her and said, "Okay, now you can drop the bomb. I'm in a good mood, and I won't make a scene. One of my quirks is that I will never get mad in public. Working for an insurance company, you never lose your cool where you can see it, and it kind of flowed into my personal life. Kat knew this, and over the years, whenever she had something to say that she thought would upset me, she would just take me out in a public place to break the news. Tonight, I felt it was bad just by looking at her face. 30 years together, and you'll learn how to read your soulmate. I had bad feelings all over the board tonight, and I just knew it would ruin my evening." Finally, she announced the bad news with trepidation. "Tom, I think you should know that Greg is back." I suddenly felt sick, but I was sure it wasn't the quality of the food I had just eaten. I stared at her for a few moments, waiting for the other shoe to fall, but Kat just stared at me thoughtfully. Finally, I broke the awkward silence. "When you say back, do you mean on vacation?" She shook her head from side to side and spoke very softly. "No, Tom, he's not on vacation. He was discharged from the Army and he bought a house 2 streets away from us." With that, my panic level started to rise, and I quickly inserted, "And he's going to live there with his, what, 3rd wife?" And again she said softly, "No, he got divorced again, but this time he had to lose part of his pension because of her." I tried to suppress my anger, but I couldn't and said, "Damn it. It's just too loud." Some of the customers sitting next to us looked at me in surprise. My expletive was not caused by the fact that Greg lost part of his pension because of his ex, but by the fact that he moved closer to us, and I needed to know his motivation for this. I became more active. "Katie, you haven't met Greg, have you?" Her expression answered my question succinctly. She didn't even answer when I asked her my next question. "When and how is Katie?" She also looked a little depressed when she answered, "Yesterday he stopped by our house to tell me that we are now neighbors." My heart was beating like crazy, and I continued the interrogation, being very afraid of what I might find out. "Did you sleep with him, Kat?" Again, her face spoke volumes before she blurted out, "I did it, Tom, but it's not what you think." I looked deep into her eyes and almost growled, "I think, Kat, that my faithful wife has slept with someone other than her husband. Now tell me why it's not what I think it is. I did it because he needed me, Tom. When he came up to me, he looked so lost. He's suffering from anxiety or something in connection with the divorce, and he needed me terribly. So I tried to help him. I love you, Tom, but I realize that I still love Greg too. Well, that's it. My wife slept with Greg, and he used PTSD and divorce as an entry ticket back into Kat's heart." I looked her straight in the eye and spoke as decisively as I had never spoken to her in the entire time of our marriage. "Okay, Kat, the damage is done. We can get through this and get our lives back, but you'll never be able to sleep with him again. Do you understand me?" She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said softly but decisively, "I can't promise that, Tom. I love him, and he needs me even more than you do." I was shocked to hear these words from her mouth. but I was aware of the fact that a public restaurant is not the place to air our dirty laundry. I called the waiter over and asked for the bill. 10 minutes later, we were in the car and heading home when I pressed it again. Kat, how can you sleep with him when you know you have a husband? Have you forgotten the vows we made together almost 30 years ago? Do you remember the part about giving up on everyone else? Now she began to cry openly and blurted out between sobs, I'm sorry, Tom, but he needs me and we found each other again. I can't bear the thought of losing him. Or you. I was at a dead end as to what I could do or say that would make her give up on him. With a hint of anger in my voice, I said loudly, Well, then what do you suggest? Do we alternate weekends? Does he get you for New Year's and I get you for Christmas? Stop it, Kat. You can't have two men. She stopped sniffing and looked at me with a strange expression on her face. How about a vacation, Tom? Now it's my time to be embarrassed. What the hell are you talking about, Kat? She changed the subject. Listen, Tom, do you remember about 18 years ago you took a year off to go back to school and get a master's degree? Well, you took it, did what needed to be done, and then returned to your previous position, and everything was fine. I shook my head irritably. Kat, how can you equate my degree, which has benefited the company and my family, with your association with this asshole, which benefits only the two of you? At that moment, I turned into my driveway and turned off the engine. Kat reached out and touched my face lovingly, uttering her plea. Tom, I missed my senior year of high school with Greg, and if I'd had that year, we probably wouldn't have faced the situation we're in tonight. Give me this year and you and I will get rid of Greg, and I promise you that I will be the best wife I can for you. I need this time, Tom. Please. I was sad, hurt, shocked, and depressed. I wanted to take Katie's neck in my hands and push until her eyes went dark. But then I remembered all these stories about prison and how cuckold husbands lose their freedom and property. Turning it all over in my head, I said, Okay, Kat, if that's what you want, you just go and do what you like. But, and this is a big but, don't ask me to authorize this, and just to be clear, throughout the year, I don't want to see you or hear about you in any capacity. Is that clear? And know that in a year, you may not have anyone to return to. I hoped that the draconian parameters I had entered for her vacation might just dampen her enthusiasm, but it was useless. It seemed that she did not hear a word of what I said after okay. She reached out and kissed me on the cheek, saying only, Thanks, Tom. You'll see. You won't regret it. I shook my head and said, It's too late. I already regret it. That night she wanted to make love to me, but I just ignored her. The thought of her with Greg made me sick, and I didn't want to be physically intimate with her. When we were getting ready for bed, I grabbed a pillow and told her that I was sleeping in the guest room. I could see that it hurt her a lot, and I was glad, because maybe now she will reconsider what this vacation will lead to. The next morning I woke up and prayed that last night was just a deviation from the norm, and that Kat would think differently in the light of day. I was wrong. When I entered the kitchen, she was making breakfast and looked like she had just won the lottery. She smiled at me and pointed to the calendar hanging on our wall. I couldn't help but notice that today's date, June 6th, was circled with a bold black line. I sat at the table and thought about the irony of this date. In 1944, thousands of soldiers and sailors sought to liberate Europe from the tyrant. Today, I lost my wife to another oppressor. Katie was almost dizzy when she brought me breakfast. Putting it in front of me, she said, I know you're worried, my love, but in a year from today, I'll come back to you and I'll be yours alone. I really need this time to think about it and get it out of my head, and I promise you that you won't regret it. She smiled at me contentedly when she spoke again. I called Greg this morning while you were still asleep and told him all about how you'd let me go on vacation and he'd pick me up in an hour. My heart skipped a beat with every word she said, but I had to give her another chance. Kat, you don't have to do this, and I wish you'd think more time before you do this stupid thing. You can't be sure that you can handle this clown in 1 year. You just need to put him out of your mind and work on getting our marriage back on track. I'm asking you not to take any chances and destroy us. She smiled at me as if I were a fool and said kindly, Tom, I know how much you love me by giving me this time. Trust me, I know what I'm doing, and eventually I'll come back and our marriage will be even stronger. Now I have to finish packing, honey, so finish your breakfast. And that's how she came out of the kitchen, and for all intents and purposes of our marriage, too. I finished eating even though my food didn't taste good, and got up to get dressed. When I entered our bedroom, I noticed that Kat had 3 large suitcases full of her clothes and toiletries. She smiled at me and said kindly, "I think I have everything I need. Please take these bags to the porch for Greg." I looked at her blankly before answering, "No." Her face seemed to stretch as she was shocked by my response. I followed up with my negative answer. "Look, if you're obsessed with ruining 30 years of marriage, then you and the asshole can take your bags together. There's no way I'm going to help you get into this stupid bed. Is that clear?" Kat looked like she was about to cry before she replied irritably, "He's not an asshole. Greg is a wonderful man and a hero who served our country. That's more than you've ever done." I turned away muttering, "Yes, he received medals, 3 meals a day and traveled the world, while I had to spend 5 days a week at work to provide for you and our daughter. I think you're right. It didn't mean anything." Katie dragged all her luggage down the stairs to the driveway and glared at me with every bag she took. A few minutes later, a car pulled up to our house, and a man, whose name I can only assume was Greg, got out and started loading her things. From our porch, Katie shouted to him that, "It's coming," and then returned to the house to say goodbye to me. We stood awkwardly facing each other, and I was the first to break the silence. "If you're really going to do this stupid thing, remember the basic rules. I don't want to see you or talk to you this whole year." I think it started to really get into her inflamed brain. What could it mean when she meekly replied, "I understand, Tom, but everything will work out, you'll see. Remember that you agreed to give me a year." She waited for me to say something, but I didn't. Finally, with a more confused expression on her face, she said softly, "I really love you." She bent down to kiss me on the lips, but I turned away at the last second, so she just touched my cheek. I spoke quickly. "I can't kiss you knowing you're going to him." She started crying and then ran out of the house and right into his arms. Standing at the front door, I watched her kiss him hard, and rage rose from the depths of my soul. 2 minutes later, my driveway was as empty as my heart, and I really realized that my wife was now another man's woman. That morning, I called work due to illness and immediately went to the hardware store to get new locks. I've been working all morning, replacing the locks in the house and changing the security codes in the alarm system. The good news was that it kept me occupied and distracted me from thinking about Katie. But when I was done, the sadness returned like a wave crashing on the shore. Then I did what any man would do. I turned off our home phone and started getting superbly drunk. The drinking I was in was actually more like looking for relief from the pain I was feeling from losing Kat, but it was a failure. My battle with bacchanalia lasted until Sunday morning. At that moment, I ran out of booze, and it was good, because I felt like I was going to die physically, spiritually, and mentally. I went to bed and fell into a deep sleep, only to be woken up by a knock somewhere in the house. I slowly woke up and stumbled along, trying to find the sound, which turned out to be my daughter Joan's knock on the front door. When I let her in, she looked shocked by my condition and the smell of booze that was floating around the house. Her first words were, "What the hell is going on, Dad?" I tried to concentrate. The hammering in my skull was getting in the way, but I managed to croak, "What do you mean?" She looked at me as if I had grown a second head. She grabbed me and headed for the kitchen. "You need some coffee and food, Dad, and then you'll explain to me what caused all this." An hour later, with food on my stomach and coffee in my hand, I told her everything I knew about her mother and Greg. To say that she was shocked would be an understatement. "Dad, let me get this straight. Does she want to take a year off from your marriage to reunite with her old high school boyfriend and let the romance run its course?" I nodded and replied, "Yes, that's about it." Her next words were the same ones I had been asking myself since Friday. "What are you going to do, Dad?" I looked at her, and the words seemed to come out of my mouth by themselves. "Tomorrow I'll get sick again and go to a lawyer." She looked sad and started talking. "I can't believe Mom would do something like that. Is it a mental disorder?" I looked at her with a blank face and replied dryly, "I have no idea, Joni." She looked at me with a sadness that I had never seen on her face before. "I do not know what to say, Dad. I want to tell you to think about it, but honestly it sounds like your best option." Joan stayed with me for a few more hours and cooked dinner so I could eat later. When she left, she kissed me and told me again how sorry she was. When she was leaving, I asked, "Why did you even show up here today?" She looked into my eyes. "Mom called and asked me to come and check on you, but she didn't tell me why or where she was." I nodded as if I understood. "Okay, thanks. And drive carefully, honey." On Monday, I really got sick and also met with a lawyer. I was right in my judgment when I confronted Katie. As a result, even though the divorce was a decisive blow in my favor due to my spouse's refusal, and this could prevent her from receiving half of my pension, the other assets of the marriage were still in play. Now I know for sure that a 1-year break with Katie could be a good opportunity to liquidate these assets. The next 3 weeks passed quickly. I was really surprised how quickly I adjusted to being alone. The positive thing is that I realized that I felt a weight lifted off me because I no longer felt responsible for another person. The downside was waking up alone and going to bed alone. I didn't see or hear from Katie until mid-July. On Saturday, I went for a drink at Flynn's, an upscale tavern in our city. I was sitting in the bar when they came in, holding hands like two teenagers in love. They were so involved with each other that they didn't even notice me sitting at the bar. Watching them, I paid special attention to Greg. He was muscular and moderately attractive, and I could understand what Katie saw in him. But he seemed to dominate her, while she seemed to fulfill all his whims. He was talking, and she was listening, looking into his mouth. When she got up to go to the ladies' room, she finally saw me sitting at the bar and gave me a shy smile. When she came out of the ladies' room, she approached me hesitantly. "Hi, Tom. How are you doing?" I wanted to tell her to get out, but I kept my manners and replied, "Oh, about as good as you can expect when your wife of 30 years has just left you for some scumbag. What else can I do for you?" She seemed confused by my sarcastic response, but stood her ground. "Tom, I need to get into our house. I left some personal stuff there, and when I tried to come in the other day, my key didn't work." I continued to smile and replied in a friendly tone, "Well, Kat, you shouldn't be surprised that your key doesn't work in my house, since you don't live there anymore." She just stood there and looked at me with a confused expression on her face before I spoke again. "I think you'd better get back to your boyfriend before he gets worried." I saw tears welling up in her eyes as she turned around and left, and I went back to more important things, namely finishing my drink. 2 minutes later, I felt a rough hand on my shoulder as I was spun around in my chair to greet a very annoyed Greg. "Hey, asshole, you made my woman cry and I don't like it." I could feel him preparing to hit me, and my heart started pounding when I realized that this guy could probably kill me before any help arrived. With more conviction than I felt, I went on the offensive. "You're talking about my wife, not your woman, and since you stole her, you have nothing to say about what's going on between the two of us. Now I'll tell you straight out, asshole, you can hit me and impress her, but what impression will the cops make on you?" I could see the wheels turning in his head, and I knew that Greg was not one of the great thinkers of the world, but it cheered me up enough to continue his verbal attack. "Now shit for brains, you have 2 options. 1, hit me and spend a couple of years in jail, or 2, get out of my sight and go sit on your stupid ass." My heart was pounding in my chest, and some part of my brain was screaming, "Why did you confront him? He's going to kill you." But I kept up the appearance of bravado while Greg stood considering his options. Fortunately, at that moment, the manager came up and asked what the problem was. Greg looked at him belligerently before answering, "No problem," turned around and slowly retreated to Katie. 5 minutes later, they paid the bill and left. Returning home that evening, I wondered what personal items Katie wanted from home, and decided to find out. I spent about 3 hours unsuccessfully rummaging through cupboards and drawers until I pulled the drawers out of her bureau. There were letters from Greg, addressed to Katie, under the drawers. When I read them, it became quite clear to me that this year spent with Greg had been in the works for a very long time. One of the letters, dated 5 years earlier, said, "It was a relief to know that you still want me as much as I want you. When I get home, I want us to be together, so you'll have to find some way to get rid of that weak husband of yours." Reading them all was like reading a trashy novel. In most of them, he describes either what he intends to do with Katie or what they did in high school. By the time I finished, it was much easier for me to live without Kat. I didn't see or hear from Kat until September 1st, when it was my birthday. When I came home from work that day, I found a covered pot on the porch and a birthday greeting card. I took them inside, where I found that she had cooked stew, which was my favorite dish. The card was supposed to wish me a happy birthday, and she wrote in it, "Tom, I know we shouldn't communicate, but I couldn't just ignore the birthday of the person I love so much. I dream about us at night, my love, and I know that when this year is over, I will be completely yours, and he will be gone. Please never stop loving me and don't leave us. Kat." My daughter Joan has been following me pretty closely since Kat left and called me on my birthday. After a short conversation, She finally gave the real reason for the call. Dad, you know that I'm due in 3 weeks, right? How could I forget the birth of my first grandchild? Yes, I know, honey. You and Frank must be so worried. A brief pause in the conversation alerted me to a potential problem when she spoke again. Dad, Frank and I went to dinner with Mom and Greg. Mom wants to be there when my baby is born, and she wants Greg to be with her. I know that you and Mom have agreed that you will not communicate for a year, but can you make an exception for me? Just once, please. I was a little stunned to find out that Joan and her husband had lunch with these two, but I wouldn't spoil the birth of her first child. Okay, Joan, she can come and bring the asshole with her if she needs to. Joan immediately corrected me. Dad, stop calling him names. He's actually not such a bad guy, and he makes Mom really happy. I haven't seen her so euphoric in years. Now I was stunned, and then I felt a wave of anger wash over me as I spat out, Your grandmother called him an asshole many years ago. Nothing has changed since then. And wow, first you all have lunch together, and now you're defending him. I do not know what he has, but I would really like to bottle it. He's going to take my whole family away from me soon. Just out of curiosity, when are you going to start calling him Dad? She spoke quickly, and I could hear the regret in her voice. Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean it to sound like that. I can imagine how you feel, and I'm really sorry. I interrupted her apologies and said coldly, It's okay, forget about it. Listen, I have something in the oven that I have to take care of. Behave yourself. She said she loved me and hung up on me. It was probably then that I realized that my life would never be the same again, and that it was time to start resisting. First, start liquidating my assets to reduce my net worth. Secondly, get rid of my fear and start coming back to the world again. The next few days were stressful for me. First, I got some advice from my lawyer about what I can do with my assets legally. Then I got a little insurance for self-defense in the form of a stun gun. I decided that the next time Greg attacked me, I wouldn't be able to talk myself out of it. Third, I booked a trip to Vegas in October. And fourth, I went online to find a woman my age who wants a good man for a stable, long-term relationship. As for my assets, I could spend them or give them away. Since my wife doesn't live with me, it seems to be up to me to decide how to distribute our assets. The reason I found it interesting is that it gave me quite a lot of leeway in what would be in my plans for the future. When Joan gave birth, I was at work, and my secretary answered the phone. The call came from her husband, Frank, and he was overjoyed to tell me that I now have a grandson. I congratulated him and said that I would be right there. When I arrived at the hospital, I found out which room Joan was in and went straight there. As I was approaching the door, I happened to hear her talking to Katie. Mom, what you're doing to Dad is incredibly pointless. Do you really want to lose him because of Greg? Kat's voice was soothing. Don't worry, Joan. I'm not going to lose your father. He loves me too much to ever let me go. Besides, what I have with Greg right now is just magical. It's hard for me to describe it, but every day is the same as in high school, only better now that we can sleep together. He treats me like I'm his princess, and every night he twists my toes. I'll really miss it when I get back to your dad. Joan sounded disgusted. Mom, I don't want to hear about your life with Greg. I admit he's an amazing guy and the two of you seem to fit together so well. But I want my child to have grandparents who are together, not divorced or fighting. Please, Mom, you have to go back to Dad, and you better do it before it's too late. He may be boring and predictable and definitely not in the same league as Greg, but Dad will always be there for you. Greg is, without a doubt, a dreamboat, but sooner or later all boats sail away. On the other hand, Dad is a rock. He will never leave you if you do everything right. Beg him on your knees if that's the case, but make him take you back. She was silent for a moment before she pleaded passionately, Mom, don't wait too long, or I'm afraid you'll lose him. Kat's voice showed once again how wrong she really was. You don't have to worry about your dad and me. When the time comes when I'm done with Greg, he'll be happy to take me back. Joan's voice was very skeptical. I understand that you think you know Dad, but I've seen and talked to him, and he's definitely changing, and it doesn't seem to be for the better. He seems embittered and more distant since you left him. Are you really willing to risk 30 years of a good marriage in order to be with your high school sweetheart? I had heard enough, so I chose this moment to enter the room and shouted with a forced smile, Hey, Mommy, congratulations on your new son. You two parents must be thrilled. I went over and hugged Joan, but pointedly ignored Katie. I know it was immature to ignore her, but it was getting easier in my life. Katie gave me a hostile look, but Joan was delighted when she asked, Have you seen him yet, Dad? I shook my head. No, baby, I just came to see how you're doing. Finally, tired of being insulted, Katie intervened in a less than cordial tone. Hi, Tom. How are you? I looked at her for a moment and didn't say anything. And then I focused on Joan again, asking her about the birth and the baby's name. At the last question, Joan's face lit up, and she exclaimed joyfully, Frank and I both agree that we want to name our baby Thomas, after you, Dad. It was at this point that Katie sullenly left the room, telling us she was going to see the baby. When she left, I took Joan's hands and held them when the tone of my voice became serious. Joan, you already know that your mother and I probably won't work out. I saw that the truth of my words hit her hard. No, Dad, don't think like that. She'll come to her senses soon and be home again. I felt my eyes mist up as I continued. Baby, now I realize that I was never enough for your mother, and that explains why she kept doing this shit. I think something is going to happen soon. Shock and disbelief showed on her face. What? I smiled sadly. In the near future, I'm going to start the divorce process after I get everything in order a little bit. She was in tears when she answered. Oh, Dad, I told Mom that she should beg you to come back, but it's really too late, isn't it? I nodded in agreement. Yes, I can't take her anymore. The memory of her cheating would be too much for me, but please don't tell her anything yet, okay? She nodded and pulled me to her for a kiss. We talked for a few more minutes about a myriad of things, but pointedly avoided any mention of my wife or her lover. Finally, I told her that I would be back tomorrow and left her to look at the baby. I found my way to the children's ward and found my grandson there among the many babies. I was thrilled with how small and precious he was, and I realized that he was beautiful. Frank immediately came up to me, standing between me, Katie, and Greg. With a smile on his face, Frank handed me a cigar. Here, Dad, have a smoke to celebrate. I put the cigar in my pocket and patted him on the back. I'll save it for later, son. Thank you. Looking at my wife and her lover holding hands like two children made me feel sick. Listen, Frank, I'll be back tomorrow when it's less crowded and the air is cleaner, if you know what I mean. Frank smiled knowingly. I completely understand you, Dad, and I don't blame you at all. As I was about to leave, Kat shyly called out to me. God, Tom, it seems like just the other day we were bringing our baby home, and now it seems so strange that our baby now has his own. I do not know where the time has gone, but it has gone too soon. I looked at her, still holding hands with Greg, and left the room without saying a word. She looked puzzled when I left them standing there. October came, and it turned out to be the best month for me since Katie left. I went to Vegas with the intention of playing at the tables and losing as an excuse to reduce our joint assets. But what made the trip so enjoyable was the cheater I met when I was there. Her name was Miranda, and she was a mature woman in her 50s. I was surprised that she was still in the profession, but she said that many men want an older woman, and in my case, she was right. Miranda was expensive, but she made me feel more alive than I've ever felt in years. For the first time since she left me, I really didn't miss Kat at all. Miranda was good both in and out of bed and seemed to take an interest in me, asking me for all the information about my future ex-wife and her new lover. Before the night was over, she knew as much about me as I did. Miranda was stunned by my story and, leaving that evening, gently stroked my face. Tom, I've only known you for a few hours, but I want to tell you something. You're a good person, and it doesn't happen that often. Trust me on this because I know what I'm saying. That I've seen and been with thousands of men, and I can count on the fingers of one hand those who I really liked and respected. You're one of them. Your wife has no idea what she's missing. However, don't let her actions and stupidity change you. And if you ever come back to the city, call me because I really would like to see you again. Miranda in Vegas left me even more confused than I was when I arrived. I thought about Miranda's words and realized that she was right. I was going to take revenge on Katie for betraying me, even though she had been a good wife and mother for 30 years before the betrayal. No, I will not leave this marriage a ruined man. When I returned from Vegas, I told my lawyer to start preparing the divorce papers. I also decided that I needed to know a little more about Greg Hollander. On the recommendation of my lawyer, I hired a firm to find out his history from high school to the present. The firm was expensive, but I didn't care, since half of the money would come from Katie's side. The firm also had a reputation for being very meticulous, and assured me that they would have all the information I requested before Christmas. I also asked my boss about moving to a branch of our company. At first he was shocked, as I always said I would never move, but that was when I still had a family. He told me he would make inquiries and let me know. Thanksgiving was the next hurdle I had to overcome. Joan called me about a week before the holidays to ask if I would have dinner with them. When I asked if her mother and the slug would be present, she hesitantly replied, "Yes." When I heard that, I firmly told her no and hung up the phone. Surprisingly, my brother-in-law called me next. Frank called my office and asked for a meeting. We agreed on a time, and I met him at a bar in the city center, which was convenient for both of us, in order to have a quiet drink. The night we met, I could see that he was excited. After our preliminary greeting, I ordered 2 double scotches. I felt that something was bothering my son-in-law, so I leaned back in my chair and listened as Frank told me about what was going on with my wife and daughter. "Dad, you won't believe that they're both crazy about him. All you can hear is Greg this and Greg that. You could have sworn he was that guy from the beer commercial, you know, the most interesting person in the world." He paused to take a sip of his drink. I was surprised when I thought he was coming here tonight to persuade me to come over for Thanksgiving. I needed to know, so I asked, "Do I understand correctly, Frank, that you don't like the esteemed Mr. Hollander?" Frank looked at me with anger written all over his face. "Dad, this man is an arrogant, self-centered, selfish fool. He's so in love with himself that for the life of me, I don't see where he has anything left for Katie." Realizing what he had just said, his face turned crestfallen and he quickly retreated. "I'm sorry, Dad, I didn't mean to be disrespectful." I smiled at him. "Don't worry, son, don't be offended. When did you start calling her Katie instead of Mom?" He looked depressed. "When she left you. I've never had any respect for her since." Now I was wondering, why does it bother you that she left me, if I may ask? His face was flushed with anger again. "I'm sure you've noticed in all the time I've been with Joan that I've never talked to you guys about my parents, and I appreciate that you've never asked about them. The truth is that my mother cheated on my father. Well, after that, my parents split up, and my dad never got over it. He got drunk to a pulp, and my mom died along with her lover in a car accident. I don't like cheaters, and now that Katie has become one of them, I really can't stand her anymore. I'm pretending for Joan's sake, but I'm worried. I had never known about Frank's parents before and felt his pain, but I was also puzzled by the source of his concern." "Frank, you say you're worried. What's bothering you, son?" He took a long sip from his glass and ordered another, then turned to me. "I'll probably piss you off when I tell you this, but you asked. The old saying, like a mother, like a daughter, scares me. If Katie has turned into a cheating fool and keeps telling my wife how great it is, how long do you think it will be before Joan comes to mind too? We already have one cheating fool. How long will it take before we have 2? "Really?" My eyebrows went up at that. "I think I understand your point of view." I joined him and took a long sip of my drink, thinking about my next move. "Listen, Frank, cheer up. I have a few surprises in my pocket, and I think things may start to change by the new year. I also want to tell you, strictly between us, that I have some plans that should make Christmas good for you and Joan, but not for others, if you know what I'm getting at." Frank smiled for the first time since he sat in the bar, and spent the next 15 minutes questioning me, but to no avail. When we were finishing our meeting, I smiled again. "Have you forgotten something, Frank?" He looked puzzled. "About what, Dad?" I took him by the shoulder. "Shouldn't you try to convince me to be a big boy and come to Thanksgiving?" Frank's smile spread across his face like a flowing river. "I'm sorry, okay. Are you coming to Thanksgiving, Dad?" I shook my head in response. "No, but I appreciate the invitation. Joan called me twice more before Thanksgiving to beg me to come, until I finally put it in perspective. Listen, Joan, when your mother left me because of this last June, I told her that there would be no connection between us for the year she wanted to end our marriage. I already broke this rule once at the birth of little Thomas, but I won't break bread with them. Is that clear? The holiday came, and I ate a frozen dinner. I was lonely and sad, but I was in a better place than if I had to watch Katie and Greg make eyes at each other. December has arrived, and with it the ghost of another family holiday. I was afraid of it, but I knew it would be the last thing I would have to endure. December turned out to be a fruitful month. First, the company offered me a position in Spokane, Washington, starting in January, if I would be interested. I told them, yes. Secondly, the private investigator's report on Mr. Hollander came in, and it was amazing. Apparently, old Greg had 3 wives who all divorced him for cheating. Add to that 2 children from other women besides his wives, for whom he still paid alimony, and the fact that his last wife received half of his pension in the divorce. The cherry on this spoiled ice cream was that Greg was transferred from E8 to E6 during his last year in the Corps. In short, his financial and moral situation seemed rather weak, if not very bad. The latest good news is that Katie will receive the divorce papers on the first working day after Christmas. Yes, now I felt the old festive spirit flowing through me. I called Joan and asked her about Christmas plans, and she begged me again to make it a real family affair. I asked if Greg would be present, and Joan got mad at me. "Dad, you better get used to it. He's part of our family now, whether you like it or not." I stopped her abruptly. "You're right, I don't like it, but for the sake of the child, I'll be there." Joan seemed really happy when she screamed, "Thank you, Dad, it will make everyone so happy." I was pretty sure that wasn't going to happen, but who am I to spoil the fun? 2 days later, after returning home from work, the phone rang, and without hesitation, I picked up the phone. "Hello?" It was uncomfortably quiet on the line, and I was about to hang up when a voice finally answered. "Tom, it's me, Kat." "What's wrong, Kat? Are you hurt?" Her voice sounded timid when she spoke. "No, I'm fine, Tom, but I wanted to thank you for agreeing to come over for Christmas. I know I hurt you, Tom, and I'm starting to realize how much, but I needed to tell you that I'm grateful, because in the last 30 years we've never been apart for a single holiday. I was unhappy on Thanksgiving without you, and I've been thinking about us so much lately." I interrupted her journey along the path of memories. "Well, Katie, I'm glad to hear that you do think about us from time to time, but I have to point out that when you started all this vacation nonsense, I stipulated that there would be no connection between us. I relaxed this rule for one day, on Christmas Day, so I think we should end this conversation now. Goodbye." When I hung up the phone, I felt terrible, because I had never spoken to her so sharply in all the 30 years of our life together. But no matter how terrible I felt about my words, it wasn't as terrible as the day she left me. The month dragged on slowly, and I had enough free time to do my Christmas shopping. I wanted to make sure I had presents for everyone for Christmas. I also packed up all the things I was going to take with me to my new job and rented a car to drive across the country. I also talked to a nice woman in my new office who said she had chosen a couple of very nice furnished apartments next to the office. The good news was that she was going to show them to me personally when I arrived in Spokane. Yes, everything was going well for me in December. I went to Joan and Frank's for Christmas and found that Katie and her asshole had already gotten there. Joan grabbed me and hugged me tightly when I came in with a bag of gifts. She made a comment about what a surprise it was, and then headed back to continue cooking dinner. I just smiled, thinking, if only she knew what a surprise this is. Frank shook my hand and took my coat when I quickly asked, "Can I see my grandson?" Frank nodded and told me that he was sleeping in the nursery, but I could look in. I crept in quietly and looked at the sleeping figure in front of me. I felt a river of emotions flowing through me, knowing that I would soon leave him, but I knew that I could not stay. I felt movement behind me as Katie came noiselessly over and stood next to me. I caught the irony that this is where she should have been since June, next to me. Katie looked at me and whispered, "We have a wonderful grandson, Tom." I was filled with sadness when I answered, "Yes, Katie, but who is he going to call Grandpa, me or the jerk, or both?" Katie seemed surprised by the question. "Why are you so stupid? You're the only grandfather this child will ever have, Tom." I muttered softly, "Let's hope you're right, Katie." And then I left the room. The next few hours were interesting, as Frank and I chatted while Joan, Katie, and Greg seemed to be living in their own world. I was disappointed by how quickly my daughter succumbed to Greg's charms. Frank just looked unhappy, but I told him to hold on because things were going to change tonight. His eyes flashed as he said conspiratorially, "I hope so, Dad. I can't stand that jerk around her anymore." At this rate, he's going to start playing with Joan soon. Dinner was served, and although the food was delicious, there was not enough company. Again, I didn't feel the need to engage in conversation with either my wife or her lover, and Frank seemed pretty reticent to speak either. The only one who spoke was Greg, as he regaled the women with stories of his courage and resilience in the face of the enemy. Watching Greg with his two-person fan club made me feel sick. After dinner, Joan brought the baby into their living room and we all sat around together. I looked at my family knowing that this would probably be the last time this family scene would play out in my life. Joan seemed happy as she excitedly told Frank to bring the presents. When he brought them, she handed them to her mom, Greg, and me. Katie got a sweater, Greg got a gift card, and I got a tie. Useful, if boring gifts, like myself, according to my wife and daughter. When Frank, Jane, and the baby opened their presents from Katie and Greg, Joan smiled and laughed, but Frank was polite but distant. When everyone finished opening their presents, the room became a little quiet as they looked at me and my gift bag. Finally, I broke this silence by saying, "I want to end this wonderful weekend by giving you all the gifts you deserve on this holiday." I got up to take the bag I had brought and handed Frank and Joan a large envelope wrapped in beautiful holiday paper. Joan tore the paper off the envelope while Frank stood and watched. When Joan took out the papers contained in the envelope and looked through them, she cried out with joy when she realized what it was. Katie shifted in her chair and seemed impatient to find out what was in the papers. Joan didn't take the time to bring her up to speed by shouting, "Oh, Mom! Dad gave us your house for free and without a mortgage. Now we can move out of this lease. Isn't that great?" Katie's face seemed to sag as she looked at me with concern. "Why did you do that, Tom? Where are we going to live?" I gave her a venomous look that I hoped would reach her heart. "Don't worry, Katie, I've thought of everything. Here, this is for you." And I handed her a postcard and a wrapped box. A timid hope showed on her face as she tore open the bright-colored paper and found a bracelet in the box. When she pulled it out with surprise written all over her face, I said, "Look at the inside of Kat. I wrote this." I noticed that Greg didn't seem very pleased that I had given her a gift. She slowly turned it over and saw the words, "Thank you for the best 30 years of my life, Tom." I glanced at the idiot, but he was still frowning over my gift. Katie looked confused. "Tom, thank you, dear. It's pretty beautiful, but you forgot to write 'with love.'" I smiled. "I haven't forgotten it, Kat. I just didn't want to lie. Over the past few months, I've been steadily losing my love for you. This bracelet is my way of saying goodbye, and will be a reminder of what you gave up for your asshole. I also have to tell you that the divorce papers will be handed to you on Monday." I distinctly heard Joan take a deep breath, and Katie's face contorted with disbelief and despair. I nodded at the postcard. Inside the postcard, I tried to express my gratitude that you gave me so many wonderful years and a wonderful daughter. There is also a check for half of our liquid assets. Of course, there are not so many of them. $195, but I registered during your absence. Vegas and dirty girls are expensive these days. The house was mine to give to my daughter when you voluntarily got out of the marriage, but all this is also explained in the postcard. I looked at Greg and thought of the volcano that was about to explode. "This gift is more for the two of you." I handed another large envelope to a visibly shaken Katie. "Inside is the full story of what your lover has been doing since you broke up in high school. I think you'll find it fascinating reading." Before I could finish my sentence, Greg rushed at me with a roar, growling menacingly, "I'm going to kill you." In fact, Greg never managed to hurt me, as he hit the floor hard when my taser hit him. Joan jumped up, as did Katie, and I touched Greg's balls twice again, just to make sure he didn't recover too quickly. When I got closer to him, I said, "It hurts, doesn't it? Well, I'm here to tell you that your pain is nothing compared to losing the woman I've loved for 30 years to a piece of shit like you." Katie was crying like the world was ending when I turned to her. "I know you think I'm boring and I'm not twisting your toes like that asshole sergeant." Remembering about him, I touched him with a taser again, only because I liked to see him convulsing, and smiled maliciously, not addressing anyone in particular. "It will never get old." I looked back at Katie, and with more bravado than I felt in my broken heart, I bitterly said, "Anyway, I know how you feel about this pile of shit, so I'm giving you the best gift of all, Katie, your freedom. Now you can spend the rest of your life being treated like a princess during the day and curling your toes at night. Wouldn't that be great for a cheater like you?" Katie seemed apoplectic when she managed to squeeze out, "No, it shouldn't have been like that. I was going to come back to you in June, Tom. I love you." Katie was shaking as hard as a leaf in a storm when Joan ran over to comfort her mother, and I electrocuted the asshole one more time before Frank nervously intervened. "You better not do that anymore. You can kill him, Dad." I stood up, looking down at my nemesis, convulsing, and then at the two women I loved more than life itself. "I'm going to leave now. Thank you for a wonderful day and for a wonderful life. Since I won't see you both for quite a while, most likely never." Both women seemed speechless and stared at me as if they no longer knew who I was. Frank brought my coat and handed it to me with a satisfied smile on his face. Before leaving, I turned once more to my daughter, who was looking at me with fear in her eyes for the first time in her life. Joan, let this serve as a warning to you. Become a cheater like your mother, and you will pay for the consequences just like her. You will lose your husband, your home, your possessions, and the love of your life. I went over to the cradle where little Tom was looking up at me and rubbed his cheek with my finger. Bye, baby. Maybe we'll see each other again someday. But for some reason, I feel that most likely not. Still smiling, I headed for the door, and turning to the hushed room, simply said, Happy New Year, guys. By the time I got to my car, the women's shock must have passed, or maybe the asshole was back in line, but I distinctly heard one plaintive voice scream, No, this can't happen to me. When I got in and started the engine, I thought Vegas was on its way to Spokane, and I wouldn't mind seeing Miranda again. As I was backing up, Frank came outside smiling and waving at me, and I waved back before heading west to a new life.